This is going to be my presentation for the sport-specific training program. I chose to do a lacrosse athlete, the female lacrosse athlete. So lacrosse is Canada's national sport. It's often referred to as the fastest sport on 2 feet. And it's gained a lot of popularity in the past decade. A lot of schools are adding lacrosse to their sport programs, and for this specific assignment, I did most of my research concerning NCAA female lacrosse athletes. So there's been a lot of research done recently into lacrosse as a sport and how to train for it specifically. So I'll give you the lacrosse game basics so we kind of know what we're dealing with here. The game consists, or the field is a 110 by 64 meter rectangular field, usually grass, although in Canada we're playing mostly inside because it snows most of the year. So there are 2 goals at either end. The game is played for 2 30-minute halves with a 10-minute halftime, and it's run time with the exception of the last 2 minutes of each half, which are stop time. So since the game is an hour or more in duration, aerobic fitness is a huge component. You also require anaerobic capacity, agility, strength, endurance, and power to be successful at the sport. Since the game varies in intensity and speed, we have to train different systems in order to be prepared to deal with the physiological demands of the sport. So a metabolic analysis will tell you that, at least in my opinion, 10% of training needs to be dedicated to the ATP-PC system. This will just ensure that you have fresh legs for each shift. Obviously, the stores are going to be exhausted almost immediately at the beginning of every shift. However, it does give you that little bit of a buffer, so if you're coming onto a shift and you need to get to the other end of the field fast, you can do that if we train the ATP-PC stores. So 30% of the training, I think, should be dedicated to the lactic acid and anaerobic glycolysis system. The intensity of the game is high, and so lactic acid will accumulate. What we need to do is train the body to be able to tolerate it and be clear it faster. So we're going to do this by training the lactic system. So the goal is to develop the tolerance and the ability of the athlete to perform at a higher intensity for a longer period of time without feeling fatigued. So what we want to do is increase the anaerobic threshold. I think 60% of the training should be dedicated to an anaerobic style of training, or an aerobic style of training. This is because the game is long, so you are required to use that aerobic system. Most of it is aerobic. So you want to create a solid base, and what you really want to do is make it so that the initial O2 debt is not as great, and you want to make the athlete better equipped to deal with the O2 demands of the sport. So if we do a movement analysis, you'll realize that essentially every movement occurs in this sport between flexion and extension at almost every joint in the body, as well as internal and external trunk rotation, inversion and eversion of the foot and ankle, circumduction of the shoulder, protraction and retraction of the scapulas, depression and elevation, plantar and dorsiflexion, pronation and supination of the arm or forearm, hip abduction and adduction, horizontal adduction of the shoulder, virtually movement in every plane although primarily in the sagittal and transverse plane, not so much in the frontal plane. So based on this, we can also do a injury analysis. So some acute injuries could be MCL and ACL tears in the knee, ankle sprains and ligament tears, shoulder dislocation and subluxation, finger injuries, concussions, cuts and contusions, pulled and strained muscles. So this sport is pretty physical. It's like hockey. So that really opens up the possibility for acute injuries. That's also why they wear equipment. So protective equipment will do a little bit, but I feel like you should also be aware of these injuries and train with preventative measures so that your body is equipped to deal with these types of demands. So chronic injuries could include IT band syndrome or runner's knee, tennis elbow, tendonitis of the Achilles tendon, as well as plantar fasciitis. Since a lot of the movement in the game, at least, is at a high intensity, high speed, this will mean that you're more on the front of your foot. So this opens up the possibility of strain through the midfoot and a tightness of the calf and Achilles. So that's definitely one to watch out for sure out of all of those. Also rotator cuff injuries because of all the movement in the shoulder, and we know that it has the largest range of motion and the least amount of stability. So shoulders are a big issue, and there's also a possibility of carpal tunnel with the pronation and supination of cradling. So client, so I already did that. So the client's strengths are, she's tall, so this is an advantage because she can grab passes up that the shorter players are not able to reach. She also has good muscular endurance and strength, so this is good because we want to build that base, and I feel like it would be easier to make her into a power athlete. She's also older and more experienced, so that comes into play too with her success. So her weaknesses are VO2 max score and her peak power output. So in order to be competitive, she needs to be explosive and strong, right? So the specific training priorities we have here are increase her VO2 max and her peak power, as well as increasing lactic threshold and tolerance and increasing speed and agility. So our acute variables for the aerobic training portion, we're going to alternate sessions of VO2 max intervals and anaerobic threshold intervals. We're going to do this because the best way to increase VO2 max and anaerobic threshold is to train at and around VO2 max and anaerobic threshold. So one thing that I did not mention in the paper was how I was going to do this. I feel that it is a more effective way of training to train by percent effort and heart rate over time, rather than taking a trial time and figuring out times and training by pace. I feel this way because we know that RPE and heart rate have a correlation. I feel like mentally and physically it's easier on the athlete. Mentally because sometimes you just can't run that pace, depending on the day, how you're feeling. You can. On other days, that pace might be too easy. I also feel like it's a little bit inaccurate because, especially with an athlete that is not a runner, not a racer, if you do a one-time trial, I don't think that that's a good indication. I feel like they're going to get better because not many people, racing is an acquired skill, and not a lot of people know how to race efficiently and effectively to get that top time, right? So I feel like, especially with just one trial, that you're not going to get an accurate 1 mile time. She can probably run it faster. So that's how I would do it. Also, you'd have to reassess halfway through. So calculating all those times becomes redundant for the second half of the training session. So we're also going to include sessions above VO2 max and below VO2 max, but so all three included in there to achieve that goal. And same thing with anaerobic. With aerobic, I would also like to mention that I would do half of the training on the cycle ergometer and half of the training on land. I would do this to prevent overtraining and chronic injuries, because we'll alternate between a higher impact exercise and a lower impact exercise, and then do most of the speed work on land because it's more applicable to the sport. So same thing for anaerobic. I would do percent effort or heart rate over distance or time. Do interval sprint training, fartlek training, and repetition sprints from fly, because it mimics what happens in a game. It's variable lengths, hard efforts, and you're not always starting from a static position. So I feel like those would be good ways to train. So we're going to try and increase alactic power, alactic capacity, lactic power, and lactic capacity, as well as VO2 max. And we want to develop the fibers that have a balance between muscular strength and endurance, because we want to be able to be powerful but also maintain that power for a long period of time. For speed, we want to increase linear speed as well as multi-directional speed. So to do this, we're going to do things like cone drills, run hills, resistance sprints. We want to focus on acceleration, those types of mechanics for acceleration and sprinting, because efficiency will be more effective and lead to greater success. So we want to train for quick changes in direction using cone drills. You also want to increase proprioception and enable the athlete to be able to duck, dive, and dodge other players at a high speed, like you would have to in a game. So for maximum power, we're going to use plyometrics. So when we look at the force velocity curve, we know that 30 to 45% of 1 RM is the optimal load to train at when you're training with plyometrics to increase peak power, because that means you're getting an appropriate amount of strength and also being able to move it more quickly before you're too weighed down to move quickly. So what I would do with this type of training, to get the most out of a session, what you could do is weighted interval training. So that would be doing a circuit or a set of exercises, and then instead of static rest, what you're going to do is go do one of the aerobic interval sets. So you just alternate between plyometric, aerobic, plyometric, aerobic interval sets, and that will get the most out of your training session, as well as your heart rate's up the whole time. It'd be very difficult, but over in a shorter period of time. And you're also going to work the cardiovascular system more because it's circuit training, which will work at increasing VO2 max. So you're always working on aerobic system. So for my 4 exercises, sport specific, I obviously couldn't have somebody here today to do them in the presentation, so if you look at the PowerPoint, there are links to my 4 exercises with my lovely assistant. I'll just describe them quickly here and why I chose them. my first exercise was a balance and reach. I chose this one because it works in improving balance. It's a single leg, and many of the movements in the game are single leg. It's a multi-joint and multi-planar exercise. And it occurs in the transverse plane, so I feel like that's important because you're balancing through the transverse plane. And it also relates to the sport specifically because it mimics a single leg ball pickup. And it also engages the core, which is important. So the second exercise I chose was speed skater ice skater hops. I chose it because it's related to the sport. As you're often changing direction and shifting your center of gravity from one side to the other at a fast pace and an intense way. So this will increase single leg power and increase muscular endurance. It's also a multi-joint and multi-planar movement, and it teaches mechanics for acceleration, which I feel is important. So you're kind of killing two birds with one stone. You can get the movement mechanics in there while still training in other ways. So the third exercise I have is a lunge with an overhead twist. It's related to the sport because lunges are quite frequent in the sport, and also your arms are above your head, and it could mimic a pass because you're turning. So it can mimic passing on the fly or during an acceleration. The arms are above the head, which promotes more core stability. And you get more balance because you're in the split leg stance. My fourth exercise is a goblet star run. Ooh, my mouth is refusing to work. Goblet star lunge. So this exercise is multi-joint and multi-planar as well. It requires stability and core musculature, and it's related to the multi-directional movements involved in the sport. Now into periodization. I split the training into 3 distinct phases. The first is basically just getting the athlete ready to train hard again because she's been off for a while with an injury, so we just want to ease her back in, create a base, anatomical adaptation for resistance training. We're just going to focus on the movements and getting used to the physiological demands of the training. We're going to focus on the quality of movements and the quality of training. So we want to build basic skills and a base to build second and third phases on. So the second phase is moving into muscular strength and muscular endurance. More so, training in multiple planes and increasing intensity and volume. We want to build a base of strength to build power in the third phase. So once they're strong and good at the movements and comfortable in working in different planes, we're going to add speed. I feel like that's a logical progression to go from strength and being able to maintain a movement for a long period of time, so muscular endurance, and then adding speed because it applies more directly to the game. And in the third phase, then she'll be ready for the tryouts. So in the third phase, we'll focus on power and exercises specific to the sport. So, for example, a Romanian deadlift with a split grip is if you're over and under, that kind of mimics your hand position on the stick, as well as like split squat lunges or split leg squats. A lot of single leg training, change direction. So like plyo push-ups would be a good one too. Or box jumps that occur in a different plane of motion. Getting the athlete ready for the game. So how these training elements will benefit one another is obviously, like I said in the beginning of the presentation, you kind of have to train for everything because the sport is so versatile and you kind of require a little bit of everything. So obviously the first priority is power and speed, but we also want to do the movements efficiently as well, so we want to focus on the movement mechanics as well. So I feel like if this were a client that I had in real life, I would be very confident in my ability to train them and prepare this female athlete to compete with the younger college athletes. I don't feel like my program would overtrain her because I would alter it and vary it and also really allow the athlete to make of the training what she will. I think that's very important when it comes to training, is really listening to the athlete and how they feel as well, because you can put everything down on a piece of paper and say this is how I'm going to train the individual, but that's not necessarily how it's going to go. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening.